The president of WOLA, the Washington Office in Latin America. I want to thank you all for being here and joining us in this event. My colleague, John Walsh, who was going to moderate, is out today, so I've stepped in for him. This is the third, I should probably say right at the beginning, you can listen in English, in Spanish, or go back and forth. Translation is available on the left side, at the bottom on the left side of the screen. You'll see a button that says floor, and you can leave that to hear English and Spanish, or select either language to hear as we go along. So this is the third in our series on taking stock of the Trump administration, its impact on human rights and democratic governance in Latin America. We had a previous session on the growth of authoritarianism in the hemisphere. We had a session last week, and this week we're focused on the threats to democratic norms, the closing of civic space, and related attacks on NGOs, and particularly on journalists. This is obviously a broad concern. It's a concern in Latin America, but right now it's a concern in the United States and elsewhere in the hemisphere as well. I think we are seeing signs of democratic decline of politicians and elected officials who discard electoral and democratic norms, often officials who've been elected democratically, but proceed to put those norms aside as they during their term in office. Some of that is clearly the result of ongoing dissatisfaction throughout the hemisphere with traditional political parties and with their inability to address the continuing economic and political dissatisfaction people have. But at the same time, though, I think we've seen a rise in dissent, a rise in protest in the hemisphere. Here in the United States, certainly we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement in response to police brutality. We've seen mass demonstrations in Chile, in Ecuador early in the year, in Colombia, in Brazil, in various places through the hemisphere, and a variety of responses on the part of government officials to those demonstrations, those protests. Some of it outright repression, sometimes pressure on civic activists, on NGOs and journalists, and all of that in a context of COVID-19 and the pandemic, which is intensified situations and provided opportunities for leaders as part of their response to the pandemic to close civic space even further. So this series focuses on the Trump administration and its role in this process. None of these concerns were started by the Trump administration. Certainly, long-standing set of issues they precede, and sadly they will continue whatever administration we have in the United States. But I think we want to focus particularly here on the ways in which those concerns exist in the hemisphere and the ways in which they've been reinforced or exacerbated by the foreign policy of the Trump administration toward Latin America. So we have three great speakers to talk to you about these issues. I'm going to try and pose questions to each of them. I'm not going to give extensive introductions. I think the bios have been included for everybody here. But I'm really delighted that we have with us Laura Gil de la Línea del Medio in Colombia, Ana Cristina Ruelas, the article from Article 19 in Mexico, and I believe we're actually being joined right now by Kathryn Ledebur from the Andean Information Network in Bolivia. So what I'm going to do is pose questions to each of our speakers. Thanks to all of them for being here with us. If you have questions, those of you in the audience, you can use the Twitter hashtag WOLA taking stock to pose those questions, and we'll try and share them with our participants. So I think I will I will start from there. I want to just, before we start, thank all of you in the audience for participating. We have a range of people in our audience, our online audience. We have government officials from across the hemisphere and people from embassies. We have congressional staff here in the United States. We have activists, NGOs, and analysts around the hemisphere. So it's a great and diverse set of people. Thank you all for being with us. Kathy, are you there? Can we? All right, let's do this. Let me start with Laura, and then I'll come back to Kathy, and then to Anna Cristina in this first round of questions. So, Laura, let me start with you. I mean, we saw in Colombia at the beginning of this year an enormous wave of protest. Hundreds of thousands of people were mobilized in the streets. They had a very broad range of demands, from questions about the public health system to questions about the peace accords and the peace process and its implementation. A lot of these demands were linked to dissatisfaction with the current government and to some of the unresolved structural issues that led to the conflict and ultimately to the peace accords. Can you talk a little bit about the situation today, about how the government reacted to those protests initially, and what, if any, program you think it has to be able to respond to those kind of demands today?
Ok. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Un gusto estar aquí. Entonces voy derecho a la...
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, in the wake of these protests in 2019, we see how, well, this went beyond the usual protests or marches that we would have in Colombia. We saw that in the city, well, this summoning power was greater than usual, because in Colombia, normally people are not summoned as much. Only about 10% of their union members would go out on the streets when called upon. However, on this case, since we see the protests in Chile and also then the brewing unrest in Colombia due to the labor reform and the tax reform that would make our context even more precarious. Well, this, in addition to those trying to uphold the peace accords. So everyone together went out on the streets because, well, for decades, we had not seen these many people protesting. And people were mobilized against the government because it was only at a 25% of satisfaction levels in the latest polls. And prior to the pandemic, the government was ready to discuss some elements with the people behind the strikes. But the problem was that with COVID-19, this was made impossible. And so the great concern for those mobilizing to defend and uphold our rights is how to continue doing so virtually if we cannot go out on the streets anymore. So the government and its red flags were raised. Well, and also in the first weeks of the pandemic, about 25% of approval of Ivan Duque became 50% satisfaction. And this because of people's anguish and uncertainty around the pandemic, because there was a relatively good management of this pandemic at the outset. So people were supportive of the administration. However, we have reached a breaking point because people are trying to see whether we go out on the streets again or we don't. And I'm sorry, this is my short answer. Thank you very much for that thorough and brief answer to our question. Now, Ana Cristina, could you please tell us more about the situation of advocates and journalists in Mexico? Because in 2019, more journalists were murdered in Mexico than in other parts of the world other than Syria. And almost half of the journalists in the world are killed. And we have received reports of harassment and threats being waged against them, and especially for those who are critical of the president and the government. So what is the current situation for journalism in Mexico, and how is this affecting freedom of speech? Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you, WOLA, for the invitation. Well, honestly, what's happened in Mexico is that the fracture in the institutions that were meant to guarantee freedom of speech have been eroded. And unfortunately, they have not been working as they were meant to, because now corruption is at a level that is unsurmountable. We have had since 2000, thousands of journalists that have been murdered. We only have been able to get to some of the masterminds, just one actually. And so the perpetrators of these attacks against journalists keep on working impune. And this impunity is worsened by the fact that these perpetrators are state agents. And we have agents from the federal government as well. Now, what happens with the pandemic is that all the fractures are exacerbated. Article 19 sees that 24 of these attacks were documented during COVID, and 69% of them are perpetrated by state agents that are trying to block this information. And also, we see that the media is not providing enough coverage on this. And so we see that politically, economically, legally, and technologically, well, they are disconnected, and we have seen it for over a decade, and now we have a confluence of effects that precisely one of the main problems that we see here in the United States is that they try to stigmatize and to legitimize the media in order to deflect and avert. And what this leads to is a polarization, and then makes journalists even more vulnerable. And this is the perfect storm. And we are concerned by how this has been seen in this administration, and we don't see any steadfast actions being taken against the perpetrators. Also, the system to protect our journalists has also been weakened. And the new government is very clear on what's happening, and they have not been following what we have issued as recommendations, and we don't see any roadmap saying that this will change.
Kathy, welcome. I'm glad we resolved the technical problems and you're here with us. Kathryn Ledebur is with the Andean Information Network. We've heard a little bit about popular protests in Colombia, the initial responses of the government, sort of how the current crisis has forced challenges and questions there about protests and dissent. We've heard a little bit about journalists under threat, the threat of violence, and the ways impunity and the failure to investigate or protect journalists has been a real issue. Can you tell us a little bit in Bolivia about the current political situation there, the status of the interim government of Jeanette Áñez, and sort of where we are after Morales sought a fourth term. There was electoral turmoil, and then his resignation. Whoops, you're still on mute. There you go.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for the delay on my end. It's important to note that Bolivia came upon the COVID pandemic already in a situation of complete crisis. After an OAS audit that claimed there was electoral fraud, right-wing protesters forced Evo Morales to resign before the end of his legally elected third term. As soon as he resigned, the following day, the Bolivian armed forces went out on the street. They exercised excessive use of force, killed multiple protesters. And the next day, after an agreement between several embassies, the church, and other political figures, Janine Áñez, a senator whose party only obtained 4% of the presidential and congressional vote in the previous elections, became president of Bolivia. She appointed herself, she was originally second secretary of the Senate, and that she was not in any constitutional line. She appointed herself with the support of a minority without the necessary quorum in a congressional session. And since that time, and although her mandate was to rule for 3 months and install election, she herself has become a candidate. She personally appointed the head of Bolivia's electoral court, which is a conflict of interest for her campaign. And during this point in time, we've seen really systematic abuses and human rights violations. 2 days after Áñez took office, her government passed a supreme decree guaranteeing impunity for the security forces for gross human rights violation. That decree was subsequently revoked, but only after the massacre of 10 protesters in Sacaba, 10 Chapari coca growers, and 11 protesters in Sencata in El Alto outside La Paz. There has been consistent harassment of journalists. One Argentine journalist was killed. Witch hunts on the part of the government to go after what they called seditious journalists, seditious foreigners, sustained political persecution of figures from MAS, and even, for example, the extreme case of the babysitter of one of the former ministers has been imprisoned for sedition. This has been subject to the outcry of international organizations, the Inter-American Human Rights Court, Human Rights Watch, Harvard University, certainly WOLA has spoken out, and our organization. But there is a pattern of systematic abuses that became more acute under the state of emergency for COVID, sustained arrests based on WhatsApp messages and tweets, supreme decrees that were incredibly repressive that initially led to many arrests and further concentration of a prison population that's already suffering gross overcrowding and has been disproportionately affected by the COVID epidemic. During this point in time, elections have been postponed 3 times, originally scheduled for May 3rd. The third time that electoral court arbitrarily postponed them based on COVID until October 18th. This was an action that was supposed to be approved by legislation of Bolivia's Congress. The MAS party holds a majority there, and they did not authorize this. So we have a situation where there's no effective state response to the COVID pandemic, but postponement of the elections based on the COVID pandemic. And we're kind of in a vicious circle of conflict and repression. And starting Monday, Bolivian social movements have gone out to block roads and to protest this postponement of the elections.
Thank you, Kathy. So I think in each country, we've heard related, although not identical, sets of challenges to the right to dissent, to freedom of expression, to the right to protest, to journalistic coverage of all of these events. In the case of Bolivia, repeated postponements of the elections and human rights abuses. Let's turn for a second to the kind of the topic of the Trump administration and its response to this. I think wide view that the Trump administration has ideologized its support for democracy in the hemisphere, criticizing fraud or potential for fraud when it thinks somebody hostile or skeptical might take office, and being much quieter in the face of challenges and democratic shortcomings on part of people they perceive as allies. I think related to that, we've seen a failure by this administration to challenge authoritarian behavior, to challenge moments when governments don't implement judicial sentences, or when they've deployed military troops to repress protests. Laura, can you tell us a bit about, in your view, what's the relationship of the Trump administration to the Duque government when the Duque government hasn't moved forward on implementing peace accords or responded one way or the other to protests, when it hasn't responded vigorously in the attacks on social leaders? What's the Trump administration done or not done to support the peace process, to mobilize others to support that process, et cetera? And obviously, the Trump administration views Colombia as an ally in its the ongoing dispute with Venezuela and the Venezuelan government, and how does that play into the picture?
Ok, entonces, la relación Álvaro Uribe entregó.
Well, Álvaro Uribe relinquished a country that had a securitized and narco foreign policy. That was the relationship with the US. And the Santos government was able to widen the array of dialogue with the United States with a high-level dialogue where they involved many more issues. Well, and they achieved first the support of the US to the peace accords, and then to broaden the agenda. Duque assumes power and immediately renders all autonomy that had been achieved during the Santos administration. You must understand that the relationship between the US and Colombia is asymmetrical, fully asymmetrical. And Santos had been able to make inroads for Colombia, but it was surrendered very swiftly. What's surprising about the transformation of foreign policy by Duque is not what was done, but how swiftly it took place. So here, two factors come into play. The first one has to do with the glyphosate fumigations. During the Santos administration, there was an increase in the amount of coca crops. And this is explained in many ways, one of them being the incentives given to families stemming from the peace accords in order for them to have voluntary crop replacement for these coca plantations. Now, this voluntary replacement is a very extraneous and costly, nonetheless effective process, especially in the way how the UNDOC office at the UN documented this and ordered this. And this was ordered for about 1%. And when they were reharvested and fumigated, we were talking about very high percentages of up to 50% were doing this. So with the fumigation policy, we see a very close relationship then developing so that this would become a narco relationship once again. And let me explain this with an example. Well, there's no way of proving this, but the facts are the facts. And the facts are that when this was being studied by the Constitutional Court, well, whether to allow for fumigations to take place or not, because it had been forbidden in Colombia to fumigate with glyphosate. Well, the justices from the Constitutional Court, well, their US visas were revoked. Many of us interpreted that as political pressure. We have no way of proving this, but their visas were revoked. That is a fact. So the relationship was politicized, narcotized, as we say, and then Venezuela was right in the midst. So Ivan Duque had promised a heavy-handed approach against Venezuela to guarantee Maduro's fall. Now it's been 2 years after that, and Maduro is still in office, still governing Venezuela, but in addition, gaining more oxygen in Venezuela, as Duque's government is aligned to different proposals and also intervention in the Colombian territory. Well, Maduro gains more territory. And so in that sense, the relationship with Trump became closer. And I say this because the world is not black and white. So it's worth mentioning that there was a change in the embassy. The new ambassador, well, the person that had his visa revoked left, and then the US ambassador quoted congressman and said that the US wanted for Colombia to keep on fumigating, and he wanted for Congress to vote on that. Now, with that new ambassador, this changed. And we saw an ambassador that was more willing to talk about the peace accord and not about these topics that were putting pressure on Colombia. So what do we see in the Trump White House? Well, there's no clear foreign policy from the State Department. There's too much space for maneuver for ambassadors to decide, to have it be their prerogative, how much latitude they have in terms of enforcing State Department guidelines. And Colombia is a case in point. And maybe things are looking differently right now in Washington, but this was after this erratic, chaotic foreign policy by Trump, which was not very clear in terms of its guidelines. And we have these new Jimadoma amendment that has to do with the bilateral agreements that could be for illegal intelligence inner workings.
Consistency and lack of clarity in U.S. policy toward the region is very important, and also the note, which I hope we'll come back to, about the role of congressional voices in U.S. foreign policy to the region. So we will come back to that. Anna, in the United States, the Trump administration and the president himself has attacked, criticized the press generally. He's created, I think it's fair to say, a hostile climate for many journalists here. He's talked about false news, fake news. He's threatened legal action against journalists. How has that sort of attitude here had repercussions on the actions of the press or of government officials toward the press in Mexico and in Central America? Have leaders adopted their similar approaches? Yeah. Have we lost Ana Cristina?
Sí, bueno, definitivamente creo que ese es uno de los efectos más claros.
I think this is one of the clearest effects. Well, we see that the top officials in Mexico and Central America have been affected by the Trump administration's policy, and this has been more obvious during the pandemic. Well, we have heard words being resonated, and quotes by Trump being used against the media and fake news, and this has had a snowball effect because we see the governors and municipality leaders and public officials using the same language, and this has eroded the way how they relate to journalism, because it has also we have seen many lawsuits being waged against journalists, and these can last for about 7 years until resolved, and these can be very costly for all parties involved, especially for journalists, and it's very difficult for them to defend themselves against slander. And this antithetical position from public officials towards the journalists, just as in the US, has led to a constant tension between the legislative and executive powers, and also the dissemination of information. And there are some laws that are meant to criticize any discourse. Now, Trump is trying to block TikTok. Here in Mexico, we have that kind of initiative taking place on a weekly basis. They're trying to block different content, and they're trying to criminalize some other outlets in the web. Something that really concerns us right now, after the free trade agreement was signed with Canada and the United States with Mexico, we see that EMC was looking at property rights that were, these rules were adopted in 98, and just this month they were ratified. And what these restriction does is to steal information from the digital arena. Even, we have some information that should be public, which is then restricted as a result. The Wall Street Journal just recently produced an analysis saying that 52,000 different sources or content was restricted, and that journalists are under risk as a result, because every time they criticize their municipality leaders or governors, they can have their copyrights infringed. And this under the cloak of accusations being waged against the governors and public officials. And what this has led to is that even if in Mexico we've had economic, long-standing economic violence and violence against journalists who are at the center of this crossfire between the government and the press, we see that the president's remarks on fake news or how the media is aligned with the opposition, well, this permeates the population and leads also to Mexicans consuming misinformation because they don't trust the media, the traditional media, especially on COVID matters. And this has led to a deeper polarization. And I think that the presidential narrative that delegitimizes the media is leading to greater impunity levels, corruption levels, and it helps them to also delegitimize the media that criticizes them even further.
What we're seeing in the United States as well, and what the president here has promoted. I'm sorry to say, I think we see a lot of that other places in the region, particularly dramatically in the last few weeks in Central America, and especially in El Salvador. Let me go on to Kathy and ask you about sort of the approach the Trump administration has taken to the ongoing disputes in Bolivia, the political situation and the electoral disputes, what kind of approach they are taking, and if that is, as I expected, a politicized approach, what would a less political approach look like?
The Trump administration, through Mike Pompeo, was one of the first to recognize the Áñez government. I think almost at the same time, Juan Guaidó of Venezuela recognized the government. And there's been a very staunch support through discourse, 2 personal tweets from Trump supporting Áñez, one a phone call to Áñez after the House Foreign Relations Committee criticized the government for abuses. And you see at the same time, a kind of doctoring of US reports that come out on the issue. So very notoriously, the report on human rights practices for Bolivia had only a few lines about the violence where it stated that human rights defenders denounced that there had been these deaths, although we gave the State Department very detailed documentation, including autopsies. And the same can be said for the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report. March was a very bad month for Bolivia in terms of US reports, where although there was decent content in the middle, they really cooked the books with the introduction and the conclusion tacked on at the end, which attributed a huge success to the Áñez government for a month and a half, the end of November and December, in drug seizures and drug incinerations and extradition, something that the facts don't bear out. So, I think the Áñez administration has kind of modeled itself off the Trump administration with brash statements, with xenophobia, with attacks on the press, and certainly the whole electoral climate. And up until this time, we've got a lot of false information, a lot of fake news, a lot of suppression of grassroots media and community radios that has kind of built us to this breaking point. And I don't see the Trump administration breaking down. There are other voices in the US government that are saner or more interested in broad engagement. And certainly 7 US senators, Democratic senators, spoke out very vociferously a few weeks ago about the abuses of the government. And I think that's an important counterweight in this case.
Thank you, Kathy. We have about 50 It's left here to wrap up. So let me come back to each of you. Laura, I have a couple of specific questions that have come in for you, and then a sort of general one. A question that came in on Twitter about the extent to which the pandemic has been served as a way to control, limit, repress freedom of expression and protest. And then I hope you can follow up a little with your comment about the role of letters and statements from U.S. members of Congress, in particular in relation to the military intelligence scandal and how that contrasts with the administration. And just overall, how might a U.S. administration approach Colombia in a more constructive way in terms of democratic norms?
Ok. Ok, entonces, comienzo con la...
Well, let me begin with how civic spaces have been closed during the pandemic. Well, it's very difficult to exercise your right to protest, which is a basic right when we have social distancing in place. So this is a practical impediment. So we are trying to work around that in order to exercise advocacy, because the only way how we can exert pressure on the government to address labor laws was by putting our feet on the ground and going out on the streets. And right after the march, Duque started a dialogue, which was that, and only that, but he said he would meet with the march organizers and at least put on the table the labor reform. But that's not what's most serious here in terms of the closing of civic spaces. I want to tell the audience that the worst thing that's happening in Colombia currently is how government is working. Because President Duque has mandated that we have a confinement that will continue with about 40 exceptions. So in the end, everybody can use those exceptions and be out on the streets. So even if they say that confinement is mandatory, everybody can be out on the streets, but not Congress. Congress is still confined in quarantine, and they are meeting via Zoom only. So it's one of the only in the world that only meet via Zoom. And people have told them there's no way to legislate via Zoom, or much less to enact laws via Zoom. So it's very difficult for us to uphold independence that way, because the court has already ruled just last Friday on this and said that Congress is a sovereign body. Yes, and they can meet as they so desire. They don't depend on the executive. However, the executive feels they can say who can be out on the streets and who cannot. And so they say that everyone else can be out on the streets except Congress. So this is only meant to rupture the legislative autonomy. So the pandemic is now posing enormous challenges for Colombia. The second question was on how to address this in the future, right, Jeff?
To say this very clearly. I think even if you get a Democrat in the White House in November, the effects of the Trump administration will be long-standing, very long-standing. There's no way we will have faith again in the leadership of the United States. Porque creo que lo que sabemos es que
because what we know now is that the United States can undergo the same crises that we have been riddled with in Latin America. I know that the US has not always upheld human rights because we've seen support for coup d'etat and others. But we've also seen here a leadership, well, that has eroded that confidence from Latin America. I think it's been destroyed. I think decades need to elapse before we trust in an American leadership once again. I believe that what senators can do is of the utmost importance. This amendment, for example, has the Sherman-Govern amendment has had great reverberations because they want to disclose whether the U.S. intelligence was gained legally or not. We see that some journalists and human rights advocates and Congress people, well, but mostly journalists have been illegally profiled and followed. And Sherman-Govern says that we need to look at, we need to go back to Ford and the 70s when we had the first limits in place, and then when it was reinforced by the Leahy Acts. We see how this has had profound impacts in Colombia. I would dare to say that all improvements in terms of human rights that we've seen in Colombia have been forced through that support for the military. Had that not happened, we would have not seen those improvements in human rights as we've seen in the past years. Unfortunately, the U.S. is not saying anything regarding the death of ex-combatants. We are talking about 222 former FARC combatants. Well, this is silent when it comes to a model peace accord. This is kept quiet. And I think that the U.S. Senate can keep on talking about human rights, but even if Biden gets there with these dark forces and the lack of confidence in the U.S. leadership, well, this will have long-lasting effects.
One side, the sense whatever happens here in this country in the next administration, the damage that's been done. And on the other hand, the recognition of the important role Congress has played in pressure on military assistance and in pushing for human rights, and some of the champions who pursued that. Kathy, let me turn to you and kind of similarly, how could, in the case of Bolivia and more generally in the region, could the U.S. or how could U.S. foreign policy play a constructive role in restoring support for democratic norms in the region?
I think there are several key things, and I think Laura brought one of them up, and that is the implementation of the Leahy Amendment. I mean, this has been implemented successfully in Bolivia twice, and I think there needs to be clarity that there can't be reconciliation in this extremely polarized situation when impunity exists for the security forces and the government authorities that directly ordered them to carry out the violence. So I think that's a very important measure, as is more accurate reporting on these issues. Certainly, much like Colombia, the coca and drug policy issue has always been a key point of friction and misinformation, often on the U.S. point. And I think they need to reach out to other voices that, you know, I think that there was a long period of time where the Morales government wasn't interested in engaging with the U.S. But what that meant is that forces on the right engaged very actively with a moderate discourse, that we now see that when they're in power, where their allies are power, it's really taken on very authoritarian cast and has become very extremist. So I think there needs to be a vision of support for fair and free elections, but also understand that those elections need to happen promptly, because we can't restore democracy with an interim government, and we can't really treat the COVID epidemic accurately with the kind of irresponsible and erratic behavior we have from this interim government.
Thank you very much. I think, Ana Cristina, you're going to get the last word here. Could you say a little bit about the ways in which a U.S. foreign policy toward the region might more positively impact the situation of freedom of expression and the case of journalists in particular, but more broadly freedom of expression and freedom of dissent, particularly in a context in which COVID is being used to limit that?
Sí, bueno, creo que hay una parte importante que no mencioné, y es que el sistema de
I think I omitted to mention something, that the protection of journalists in Mexico and Honduras has been accompanied by USAID. And in that sense, they've also accompanied a process whereby we integrate this protection for journalists in addition to the combat of these egregious crimes against the press. And it's worth saying that in our countries, we need more tactics, because there's protocols that have been followed by organizations working in favor of freedom of speech. However, the General Attorney's Office in Mexico still lacks clear protocols that allow them to prosecute these cases of abuse against journalists. And they need to enforce the new laws that were recently passed to make the Attorney General's office more autonomous. And they're not measuring these abuse, especially during the pandemic. And they are not following the main causes of these abuses, as they are trying to oppress them and trying to make them keep silent. The US government has directly supported this process towards a new penal process in Mexico. And everything that doesn't work effectively in Mexico, well, what they're trying to do as a response is to go back to what they were doing in the past. So they're thinking, well, if this new process doesn't work, if this new criminal process doesn't work, let's go back to what we know, even if flawed. And that's why there's no progress in this sense in terms of protection for journalists. And it's and they are resisting change, basically. And so I think that what's lacking is for them to think in the long term and to not drop the ball, so to speak, because if you ask me what would happen if this protection mechanism for journalists would disappear in Mexico, would be that better than what we have now? Well, no, I'd say it's better to keep it as is than for it to disappear, because you have risk analysts, we have specialists looking into this. We know that there are many shortcomings and weaknesses, but the government needs to keep this, as it's taken a lot of hard work and it has had the support of the people and the international community.
Thank you, Laura and Kathy. We're going to wrap up here because we're approaching 12 o'clock. This has been a great and very broad discussion. I think it's highlighted a couple of things. One is that there are major challenges to democratic governance, including freedom of expression, freedom of dissent, freedom for journalists in the hemisphere and in the United States. That's a long-term and ongoing process. Is a major challenge for activists for human rights and good governance everywhere in the hemisphere. The United States has long played a sort of mixed role in these issues in the hemisphere, as Laura indicated. But I think we have seen both in the Congress and in some of the work that USAID has done around freedom of expression and in some other areas, ways in which the U.S. can play in fiscal reform and so on, play in reform of the Fiscalia, the Attorney General's office. The U.S. can play a constructive role. I think we're at a moment right here in the United States where we've got both a bad model here in the United States and an ideologized approach, and sometimes an approach seen through a very narrow drug trafficking only or very single-minded kind of lens. While even if we have a change in administration or change of heart in this administration in the future, there's been extensive damage done to the U.S. ability to be helpful and constructive in the region. Nonetheless, there are things that the U.S. can and should do, including returning to more depoliticized, less ideological approaches to supporting free and fair elections and democratic governments, to supporting the right of dissent, to supporting protection for journalists and an end to impunity and the mechanisms like criminal investigation, Attorney General's office, investigations of human rights abuses that could reduce impunity and strengthen the rule of law and the right to dissent. So that's a lot all at once. I want to thank you for this very rich discussion, and end by reminding everybody that we'll have a fourth and final session in the series next Wednesday at 11 that will focus on migration in the Western Hemisphere and the challenges that presents. So thank you all for participating in the audience, and thank you to all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you.
ciao. Thank you all.
Ciao.
Bye.